For centuries, people have asked the question, was Alexander Sawney Bean real? Was there really a mass-murdering family lurking in southwest Scotland in the 16th century, or even in the centuries before that? Was the story of Sawney Bean folklore, a morality tale, anti-Scottish propaganda, or history? I am Yvette, and for this Defragged History special, I dive into the horrifying tale of Sawney Bean and his family, its origins and impact. For those with weak stomachs, turn around now, because beyond these words lies death, grueling death. Oh, you're still here? Good. Centuries ago, everyone in the Galloway district in West Scotland knew that the roads weren't safe. It often happened that travelers left towns to continue down the western road on their way to another village and never arrived. It was as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. It happened too often, and many desperate folks were left behind wondering what had happened to their loved ones, family members, friends, who wandered down the path, never to emerge on the other side, and they hadn't left a single trace. Well, there were some traces. For years, when the tide was right, body parts washed up ashore from men and women, and everyone who heard about it got scared. No one knew where they came from, or whose body parts they were. The locals sent spies to scope out the area. Many of them never returned, and those who did saw no one, never found evidence of foul play, and if the vanished had been murdered, there wasn't a trace of the body, and no one could figure out what had happened. Everyone eyed everyone with suspicion, especially strangers who ventured into the area wanting to conduct honest business. In the end, various innocent travelers were arrested on suspicions of having committed some of the heinous acts. Some of them were convicted and hanged on the slightest evidence or eyewitness testimonies. Despite all the local law enforcement officers' best efforts, the disappearances didn't stop. Gradually, everyone began to suspect the innkeepers, who claimed the travelers who'd stayed the night had left and gone down the path. Instead, they believed that the innkeepers robbed them, murdered the poor souls, and carefully buried the bodies so they wouldn't be discovered. Now, innkeepers who hosted folks in their inns the night before they vanished were put on trial and executed. But not one of those executed ever confessed at the gallows. They insisted to their last breath that they were innocent of the horrendous crimes for which they'd been accused. Many innkeepers with inns on the western road of Scotland abandoned their businesses, fearing they might be made examples of, and looked for other jobs. Now travelers had no place to stay the night, or to refresh themselves or their horses. Soon there was virtually no one left who lived in the area. Still, travelers disappeared without a trace, as often as before. When the magistrates found it was all in vain, they stopped these rigorous trials and instead prayed that God would protect them and reveal the perpetrators of these barbarities. The news of the many disappearances spread across the country. Many citizens demanded to know how these crimes could be committed without leaving a trace and why no one could find them. Someone or something had to be lurking in the area. Something dark, evil, and twisted. But there were never any witnesses. Then, one evening, a man with his wife sitting behind him on the same horse rode home from a fair. Suddenly they were surrounded by men, women, and children who furiously charged at them. The man bravely fought off the merciless attackers with his sword and pistol and used his horse to knock some of them over. During the chaotic and fierce battle, the woman fell off the horse onto the ground. She was butchered on the spot before the husband's eyes. The females cut her throat and fell on her, sucking her blood with great gusts as if it had been wine. After this, they cut her belly and pulled out her entrails. The man, horrified by this dreadful spectacle, redoubled his efforts to make it out alive. If he fell into their hands, it was over for him as well. The Lord God's favor was upon him. A group of 20 or 30 people coming from the same fair came up the road. Right then, the bloodthirsty group withdrew and plowed through the thick woods and disappeared into the darkness. The man was the first ever to escape with his life. He told his rescuers of the horrible death of his wife, whose bodies the murderers had dragged for a bit, but then left behind. All were stunned and shocked to hear the story. They took the poor man with them to Glasgow, where he recounted all that had happened to the city's magistrates. They immediately sent a notice to King James telling him what awful deeds were happening in his kingdom. About 3 or 4 days later, His Majesty himself, with some 400 men and many bloodhounds, set out for the location where this dismal tragedy occurred to put an end to these atrocities. The man who'd been attacked showed them the way. The king's men searched behind all the rocks, prodded every bush, looked in every crevice and cave to apprehend the hellish group of murderers, the ones who'd been stalking the western part of his kingdom for so many years. They found nothing. No dwelling, no home, no hut, no shelter. They looked along the shores but had to wait for the tide to go out. Along the rocky cliffs, they passed a cave they didn't notice at first. But some of the bloodhounds yanked their minders into the misty cave and immediately started barking, howling, and yelping. The king and his attendants returned to investigate. When they looked inside, it was all black. How could anyone live in such pitch-black darkness? They ventured further inside, and the bloodhounds barked ever louder. Something was living here. The king sent for torches to be brought over. Once they arrived, many men entered and followed a maze of intricate turnings and windings. Then at last they arrived at the private recess, the home of the monsters. Everyone, or as many as could, entered and were in absolute shock at what they saw. Some were ready to sink into the earth. Legs, arms, thighs, hands, and feet of men, women, and children were hung up in rows like dried beef. Many limbs lay in pickle, and a mass of money, both gold and silver, with watches, rings, swords, pistols, and a large quantity of clothes, both linen and woolen, and an infinite number of other things were thrown together in heaps or hung up against the sides of the den. These were the possessions of those they had murdered. The overwhelming force descended on the group. It was Sawney Bean, his wife, and their 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters, all inbred. Alexander Sawney Bean was born in the 16th century in the county of East Lothian, some 8 miles east of Edinburgh. His father worked as a hedger and ditcher and raised his son to follow in his footsteps, preparing him to do the same tough job. But Sawney was lazy and wasn't interested in honest employment. The very idea bored him to tears. One day, Sawney left his family home for good and went into the desert country and took a woman with him. Some say she was Black Agnes Douglas, and she was as wild as he was. Many believed she was a witch. After roaming southern Scotland as outlaws, the couple ended up on the shores of Galloway County. They made a home in a cave at Bannan Head, located between Girvan and Ballantrae in today's South Ayrshire. The subterranean home reached almost a mile underground. It was dark, dank, difficult to reach, and locked off 200 yards in during high tide. It was so dark that if anyone stood at the mouth of the cave, they could never see inside it. In other words, it was the perfect place for the criminal duo to hide. The outlaws remained out of sight. They never visited cities, towns, or villages. They never entertained visitors and kept to themselves. No one even knew they existed. They found the ultimate way to have income. They robbed everyone who passed through their neighborhood. Those they robbed, they murdered. Those they murdered, they brought back to their cave. Sawney and Agnes cut the bodies into quarters and pickled the smashed limbs. This was their food, their only food. However, they killed so many that they ran out of room to store it all. Whenever they had too much, they tossed the legs and arms of the unfortunate travelers into the sea at a great distance from their murder cave. They stored any easily traceable valuables that would reveal who the victims were. Any cash they had on them they used for life's essentials. They remained out of sight for 25 years. They had children. Those children had children, who also had children. All their inbred offspring was raised in Sawney and Agnes's likeness, savage, untamed, isolated, never taught humanity or civility. From the moment the kids were old enough, they taught them to participate in setting up the lethal traps. Their traps were carefully set up so that no one could ever escape, locking the victims in on all sides. Even if an unfortunate traveler managed to flee from the initial attack, they'd walk straight into the next ambush. And the next. That's why no witness ever made it out alive, so that no one could tell anyone what happened afterwards. but they were careful and never overplayed their hands. They attacked up to 6 on foot, but they never attacked more than 2 horsemen. Their home was so concealed that the hunting parties, despite their searches, never found them. For those who noticed the cave let it be. No one believed a human being could live in such a dark and dismal place. While the number of people these savages destroyed was never exactly known, it was estimated that during the 25 years of butchery, they had killed at least 1,000 men, women, and children. Their reign only ended when a man and his wife rode home from a fair, and the man escaped death to tell the tale of Sawney Bean and his family. The evil clan were all seized and restrained by His Majesty's order. The king's men took all the limbs and body parts they could find and buried them in the sands. Then they took all the spoils and returned to Edinburgh with their prisoners. As the imprisoned family made their way across the country, everyone came out to see the cursed tribe being carted off. When the procession arrived in Edinburgh, the wretches were all locked up in the Tolbooth prison. The following day they were escorted to Leith, surrounded by a strong guard. No one felt it was necessary to put the heinous creatures on trial. The enemies of mankind were all executed. The men were dismembered. Their hands and legs were severed from their bodies and they bled to death in a few hours. The wife, daughters, and grandchildren who watched this just punishment inflicted on the men were afterwards burned to death in 3 fires. They all died without showing any repentance. Instead, they kept cursing and shouting the most dreadful swear words until they took their last breaths. Such was the story of Sawney Bean. But is it historical fact or fiction? Probably both. The legend of Sawney Bean first appeared in print around the year 1700, over 100 years after the tale allegedly took place. This was during a very significant time in the history of printing and publishing in Britain. While at this point books had been printed for over 200 years, many people couldn't read, and the books were expensive. But at the end of the 17th century, literacy improved, and there was a new audience for the written word. However, bound books were still expensive to make, and the publishers found a solution. Apparently, the Legend of Sawney Bean was first printed as a so-called chapbook. Chapbooks, or broadsheets, had chapters printed on each side of a large sheet of paper that the reader had to cut and fold into a 4-page book. Because no bookbinding was involved, these chapbooks were affordable and very popular. The first page was a cover, title page, and advertising in one. The titles were long and very descriptive, like a sales pitch, and always contained a sensationalized account of a popular story. For instance, one of the 4 surviving broadsheets, the earliest dates from a little after 1764, featuring the story of the Bean clan in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, reads, "The life of Sawney Bean, the man-eater, who inhabited a cave near the seaside in the county of Galloway in Scotland upwards of 25 years, to which is added the droll jester or laugh when you can." Incidentally, note how there is an E added to Bean. This is an English edition. While there are variations to the Bean name, the name is not spelled this way in Scotland. Perhaps the spelling of the name in the legend was never formalized until it was written and printed in England in the 18th century and then incorrectly with an extra E. There is no audible difference between the pronunciation of the words bean and bane in the Galwegian dialect, even today. The dictionary definition of bane is a source of harm or ruin, destruction, poison, or thing causing death. The older word is more specific. The Old Scottish bane meant murder or murderer. The Old English bana or the Old Norse bani both meant death or slayer. Sawney is Lowland Scots for Alexander, so in the ancient language, Sawney Bean and Alexander the Killer are the same thing. Though Sawney became a slur for anyone of Scottish descent as early as 1657. Though no copies of the earliest prints exist anymore, the legend was included in a book of collection of tales about highway robbers, pirates, and other true crime stories by Captain Charles Johnson, printed in 1724. So, the story, the perfect length of a chapbook, was likely older than that. Johnson was a mysterious author who, considering his book also included stories about pirates, was probably a captain of a ship, while some believed Captain Johnson was in fact Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe. But stylistically, they appear very different. During the 1820s and 1830s, printing became more technologically advanced with the rotary steam press and machine-manufactured paper, and books became cheaper. After about 1840, books were available at a reasonably low price to a public eager to read them. The Sawney Bean story I just told was adapted from John Nicholson's historical and traditional tales connected with the south of Scotland from 1843. The Sawney Bean story fit nicely into the Gothic horror tales that were so popular at this time, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and John Polidori's Vampire. The market was big, one would argue it still is, and from this moment on, the story kept being reprinted as Nicholson wrote it. Nicholson made a few changes to the story. He updated the language and made it acceptable for a prudish Victorian audience, but since his version was widely published, it became the definitive tale of Sawney Bean. Nicholson did make one curious change from Sawney Bean was born sometime in the reign of Queen Elizabeth while James I governed Scotland to in the reign of James I of Scotland. Nicholson moved the story back 200 years for some reason. This change exposes the first problem with the tale. While Sawney Bean's legend's details remain fairly constant in every version, it seems no one can agree on when the story actually took place. Currently, the generally accepted timeline is 16th century Scotland during the reign of King James VI of Scotland, the later King James I of England. Nicholson placed it in the 15th century. Others believe the story happened in the 14th century during the time of King David II, or the 11th century during the reign of King Macbeth, while still others consider it a story originating from the 9th century. Well, everyone might be right, because the printed version of Sawney Bean contains a few glaring problems. The first problem we run into when examining the Legend of Sawney Bean as it appeared in print is math. In 25 years, to have as many offspring as said in the story, 5 of the first 6 children would have to have been girls, who started giving birth around age 13. In the 16th century, puberty generally didn't start until the age of 16. At the time of capture, the 6 daughters would have been between the ages of 19 and 24, the 8 sons between 11 and 18, and the 32 grandchildren between the ages of 3 and 10, making the clan more of a kindergarten than a group of killers. And the women had to fight to kill the alleged 1,000 victims while almost constantly pregnant. And let's not even talk about the high mortality rates of little children born in a cave, which makes the whole grand family of butchers a statistical improbability. But exaggeration is common in stories. Then there is the cave. Some believe it is located at Bannan Head, which is kind of a tourist attraction now. This cave gets blocked off by the tides, but it doesn't get flooded. Of course, there are other suggestions. The Bannan Head location was an invention by Samuel Rutherford Crockett in his 1896 book The Grey Man, though the cave in question doesn't fit his own description. Rutherford was a Galloway man and was able to infuse the story with a more local flavor. The original story merely states a cave in Galloway, a rather lawless place. More on that later. There are hundreds of caves, or coves as they're called locally on Galloway's coast. Archaeologists found evidence of ancient occupation in them, like piles of bones, tools, and defensive works at the mouths of the coves. Some have hanging stalactites, reminiscent of the strung-up body parts in the Legend of Sawney Bean. However, the cliffs of Galloway are made of hard Silurian rock, greywake, and shale. Waves couldn't create the deep cave dwellings with winding maze-like tunnels as described in the tale. These caves do exist, just not in Galloway. That doesn't mean there was never a cove large enough to house the Bean family. The one at Bannan Head is only 660 feet deep, but others could have simply eroded over time. Another problem. According to the story, the only living witness came from a fair, but there were no fairs, big or small, in Galloway before the story was first printed. Also, this was a sparsely populated area, so a group of 20 or 30 people traveling from this non-existent fair to arrive just in time to rescue the poor man under attack seems also unlikely. Once the witness was heard, they went to the provost in Glasgow. Glasgow is 50 miles away and too far away for anyone to care. The Sheriff of Ayr at the Royal Burgh in Ayrshire would have been the one to call on, and the journey to Glasgow would have passed through Ayr. Another location, the Edinburgh toll booth, in constant state of being built and torn down, was in no fit state to house prisoners. And there is no evidence that the Bean clan were executed in Leith, which is a strange location anyway, because Edinburgh had plenty of execution places, one right next to the toll booth in fact. And such extreme executions would have been a rarity in Scotland, and recorded in the books. Lastly, Sawney Bean's father was a hedger and ditcher, but most historians say these were very unlikely professions in 16th century Scotland or in the centuries before, but the job was around during Captain Johnson's time. While all these facts can be considered embellishments to an older legend, there is another damning aspect to the story: lack of evidence. There are no contemporary documents, diary entries, pamphlets, or court records mentioning the trials and the execution of innkeepers, the disappearance of hundreds of people, the dramatic discovery of the murderer's family, or their execution. Of course, few records were made of the ordinary folk, less so of the ordinary folk in Scotland, and even less so of those living in Galloway. But all stories and legends are passed down the generations to praise a hero, decry a villain, or to teach a lesson. Sawney Bean has all three. But there isn't a single trace of a local oral tradition about Sawney Bean, and even more concerning, no one wrote songs about it. Of course, stories can disappear if no one is left to tell them or sing about them. Once we strip away the historically inaccurate embellishments and look at the core story, cave dwellers, missing persons, mainly travelers, cannibalism, a ruler to the rescue, and death by burning, we may figure out when in time the legend of Sawney Bean was created. First, we should settle once and for all whether this dapper ruler could have been James I of Scotland or James VI of Scotland and the later James I of England. King James I of Scotland became king in 1406, but since he was a hostage in England, he wasn't coronated until 1424. But it's unlikely Sawney Bean was a 15th century creation, and here is why. The Sawney Bean tale takes place in Galloway on the west coast of Scotland. This location doesn't appear chosen by accident. Galloway had a reputation of being a wild and untamed place inhabited by primitive, bloodthirsty and savage people who, if not actual cannibals, used human corpses in horrific ways. The Romans knew it, the Normans knew it, and the Scottish kings trying to control the place knew it. Christianity arrived late in Galloway because of the isolated nature of the place and the character of its people. The Christian scribes who observed them wrote unfavorable reviews about the Galwegians, condemning them as the most primitive and bestial in Britain. The Galloway men killed priests and monks, desecrated Christian churches, raided into England to enslave large numbers of young men and women whom they traded to the Irish for cattle. Alright, so no different from the Vikings who visited the British Isles in the preceding centuries. Galwegians were technically vassals of the King of Scotland, but Galloway's local chiefs were de facto kings who maintained their independence. Depending on who was winning the endless wars, they sided with the Scottish kings one moment and the English kings the next. For instance, the Galwegian MacDougalls aided the Scottish army to defeat the Norsemen at Largs in 1263. But during the First War of Scottish Independence, when King Edward I of England invaded and camped near Gatehouse of Fleet in 1300, they sided with him and were rewarded for it. While King Robert the Bruce forged most of Scotland into one nation, Galloway remained on England's side. After King Edward died, Bruce invaded the region but had to retreat when an English army led by the Earl of Richmond approached. A second invasion, led by Robert's brother Sir Edward, succeeded after 2 bitter battles. He laid waste to the country with fire and sword and permitted every kind of plunder. Yet, in 1339, Galloway chief Duncan MacDougall decided his position was strong enough to return to the English side. He swore allegiance and was pardoned for accepting Scots rule. King David II of Scotland invaded Galloway again, and although Edward II sent help in 1342, the Scots drove them back, and it was game over for Galloway independence. Galloway was now part of Scotland, and the MacDougalls rapidly fell from power as the clan of Douglas ascended. The House of Douglas's base was Threave Castle, and kept on their constant border warfare. At this point, the Douglas clan's power was so great that the Scottish kings were afraid to mess with them. During his 12-year reign, King James I of Scotland obeyed the church and executed nobles, imprisoned them, and/or took their land. But he knew better than to mess with the House of Douglas in Galloway. If the capture of the Sawney Bean tribe had taken place during the reign of King James I, he wouldn't have dared venture into Douglas country to hunt the criminals. He would never have made it out alive. Besides, the Douglas clan had a very special set of skills to handle the likes of the Bean clan. They wouldn't have needed James's help or sent him to Edinburgh for their judgment. After King James's assassination in 1437, kings still feared the Galloway men, and propaganda kept up. 3 years later, King James II's forces attacked and seized Threave, and the power of the Black Douglases was broken in Galloway forever. From now on, Scottish royalty could visit Galloway and leave alive. We know King James VI of Scotland did. For instance, he stayed at his royal castle at Kirkcudbright in 1587. His visit is well recorded, down to the tiniest details. On paper, King James VI was certainly a match to be the hero of the Sawney Bean story. After all, he was the king of witch hunters. James Stuart was born in 1566 to Queen Mary of Scots and Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. Mary, the only surviving legitimate daughter of King James V and Marie de Guise of France, inherited the throne of Scotland on the death of her father when she was only 6 days old. At 16, she married François II, the King of France, and when she returned to Scotland after his passing, she brought many European ideas with her. Witch hysteria ran rampant in Europe, but it only now arrived on the British Isles. The witch, as a type of heretic who was constantly pursued by the Inquisition in Europe, was virtually unknown in Scotland until Mary, Queen of Scots, passed a law against them. If any person or persons shall use, practice, or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil or wicked spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil or wicked spirit to, or for any intent or purpose, or take any dead man or child out of his or her grave, or the skin, bone, or any other part of any dead person to be employed or used in any manner of witchcrafts, they shall suffer the pains of death. Queen Elizabeth I of England had also passed the Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments, and Witchcrafts in 1562. Both witch acts followed the European line of thought. Cannibals were witches were heretics. In Scotland, burning became the prescribed punishment for a traitor, heretic, or a witch, not for a murderer, and torture was used to extract confessions from them. However, in reality, most witches were garroted and their bodies were burned after. Witches weren't burned in England. Only direct dissenters of the established religion were treated as heretics and burned. At the same time, the Scottish Reformation was happening. But the punishment of witches remained under the Reformed Church, and the persecution of witches was carried out more thoroughly than before. In 1567, 1-year-old James was crowned King of Scotland because his Roman Catholic mother had fled to England because of her husband Lord Darnley's murder that she may or may not have been involved with. But the Protestant Queen Elizabeth imprisoned her and had Mary executed for allegedly plotting Elizabeth's death. Meanwhile, the Presbyterian clergy raised James, molded him into a strict Protestant, and put the fear of Roman Catholics in him. He grew up to be a neurotic, if clever man with a witchcraft fixation. In 1590, when James and his bride Anna, the sister of King Christian IV of Denmark, headed for Scotland, the ship was blown off course near the coast of East Lothian. James believed witches were the culprits. He alleged that a number of witches had gathered at the St. Andrew's Old Kirk in North Berwick in East Lothian on Halloween night and attempted to end the king's life using magic. so they could place Francis Stuart, the Earl of Bothwell, the illegitimate son of James V, on the throne. Over 70 people were implicated, including the ringleader, Dr. John Fian, a schoolmaster, and James was deeply involved in all the proceedings. He personally questioned the witnesses during these North Berwick witch trials. He ordered the extreme torture of the accused in the old toll booth in Edinburgh to get their confessions. In the end, Bothwell escaped from Edinburgh prison while the accused witches were burned to death, both as traitors and witches. After this incident, King James was convinced witches were real, and in 1597 he wrote a dissertation on witchcraft and necromancy and published a textbook for future witch hunters called Demonology. He believed there was a fearful abounding at this time in this country of these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters. From that time on, he turned up the witch hysteria to 1000 and was responsible for the 1590s peak in burnings. When Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, James became the ruler of both Scotland and England. One of his first acts was to tighten up Elizabeth's Witchcraft Act of 1562. He didn't introduce the punishment of burning in England, that was still hanging, but now proof that witchcraft caused harm was expanded to those who confessed using witchcraft in any form or had been proven to be witches. After the gunpowder plot of 1605 to blow up Parliament was discovered, James directed the torture and trial of Guy Fawkes. On paper, the king of witch hunters, James VI, was perfectly cast in the role of destroyer of the Bean clan. But there is a problem. Of course there is. Had James mounted such a hunting expedition, he would have shouted it from the rooftops, and probably even written a paper about it. He didn't. Not a word, not a peep, no records, nothing. As we've just heard, there's plenty of evidence of his involvement in the witch trials and the gunpowder plot, and his visit to Kirkcudbright is documented within an inch of its life. So, is the story made up? Yes and no. While no records exist of the Bean clan, the legend wasn't an isolated tale, but one in many similar documented stories that may all have come from the same root. Archaeological evidence shows cannibalism was practiced universally since the human race began. Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Age people all left the same type of evidence of cannibalism. Man ate man, for instance, because of famine, for ritual or magical purposes, or because people wanted to scare their enemies. For them, magical powers came from the human head and human blood, but also caves, streams, and wells. The Christian Church, wanting to stamp out paganism, branded these beliefs and practices evil. They used this tactic to turn people away from paganism and bring them to God and into the Church for protection and security. The reason why the idea of cannibalism turns our stomachs today may well originate from this Christian indoctrination. Those who continued to exercise their pagan rites were subjected to harsh persecutions. Ironically, once the Inquisition entered the chat, it used primitive and bloody practices as savage as the ones they were supposed to be eliminating. And things got confusing with the Christian ceremony of communion, when the bread symbolizing Christ's broken body and the wine representing his shed blood were consumed. Some new converts believed that they dipped the host into the blood of a sacrificed child. The story of Sawney Bean could have been based on older stories like Christen Cleek, or both came from the same, even older source. The first records of Christen Cleek are found in the Scottish Chronicle of 1341. It described the arrival of Galwegian chief William Douglas at the siege of Perth, bringing with him out of France in 5 ships both men of war and also munitions of armor, artillery, weapons, which served the Scotsmen in that season greatly to purpose. However, in a paragraph inserted below, it said, "In the same year, or in the year following, there was such a miserable dearth both through England and Scotland, that the people were driven to eat the flesh of horses, dogs, cats, and such like unused kinds of meats, to sustain their languishing lives withal, yea, in so much that, as is said, there was a Scottish man, an uplandish fellow named Tristacloak, spared not to steal children and to kill women, on whose flesh he fed, as if he had been a wolf. There was a famine during the reign of King David II of Scotland, who ruled from 1329 until 1371. The nation was close to ruin. The country was repeatedly harried, first by King Edward I and then by his son King Edward II. The land had gradually got out of cultivation, and many of the sheep and cattle on which the people relied were driven into England or slaughtered to feed the invading armies. It became difficult to buy food, and those who had money fled to Flanders. Those who stayed behind left their homes and foraged in the woods trying to find anything to eat. Bodies were found clutching half-chewed tree branches. To make matters worse, during this severe famine, Hector Boyce recorded floods, murrain, and plagues of mice and ratones throughout Scotland. Around 1420, Andrew Wintoun's original Chronicle of Scotland wrote down this version of the story of a Quiston Cleek. As the story goes, Tristicloak or Christy Cleek's real name was Andrew Christie, a butcher from Perth. Christie joined a group of scavengers in the foothills of the Grampians. When one of the party died of starvation, Christie put his butcher skills to work on the corpse and provided his companions with a ready meal. The group developed a taste for human flesh as, under Christie's leadership, they began to ambush travelers in the passes of the Grampians, feeding on their bodies and those of their horses. It is alleged that before attacking, Christie would haul his victims from their mount with a hook on a rod. This tool was called a cleek or crook, hence the name. 30 riders apparently died at Christie's hands. Eventually, the company was defeated by an armed force from Perth, except for Christie himself, who supposedly escaped. In the 19th century, Cheviot's Proverbs added, "It is said Christie Cleek died many years later, a married man and prosperous merchant in Dumfries." For centuries, the mere mention of the word Christie Cleek was sufficient to silence the noisiest child. While Christie started cannibalism because of hunger, a little over 100 years later, another story appeared, where hunger apparently wasn't the cause. In 1460, Lindsay of Piscotty recorded a story in the Chronicles of Scotland of a brigand who was taken with all his family who haunted a place in Angus. This mischievous man had an execrable fashion to take all young men and children he could steal away quietly or take away without knowledge and eat them. And the younger they were, esteemed them the more tender and delicious. For the which cause and damnable abuse he and his wife and bairns were all burned, except for a young wench of a year old, who was saved and brought to Dundee, where she was brought up and fostered. When she was 12, she developed a cannibal appetite, and she was condemned and burned quick for the same crime of her parents. It was said that when she was coming to the place of execution, there gathered a huge multitude of people, and especially of women, cursing at her that she was so unhappy to commit so damnable deeds. To whom she turned about with an ireful countenance, saying, "Why scold you me, as if I had committed an unworthy act? Give me credence and understand. If you had the experience of eating men and women's flesh, you would think it so delicious that you would never forbear it again." So without any sign of repentance, this unhappy traitor died in the sight of the people. The story was the same as Hector Boyce's, who added that they trapped people, whom they then killed. This story might be a prototype for the Legend of Sawney Bean. There are many similarities, most notably the unrepentant death by burning. So, the Sawney Bean legend is older, but why was the story printed at this time, around 1700? Some say it was politics. When Sawney Bean was first printed around 1700, Britain was in turmoil. When wasn't it? But this was the time of the Union of the Crowns, the creation of Great Britain. It was an era when anti-Jacobite feelings ran high in England because the English feared an invasion from Scotland, by which the Jacobites hoped to get James Francis Edward of the House of Stuart on the English throne. From this union of Scotland and England came the phrase Sawney Hapeth, aka Sawney Halfpence, used to describe something that was worthless or a fool. At this time, a Scottish pound was worth 1/12 of a sterling pound. Therefore, some believe the Legend of Sawney Bean was printed as political propaganda to show how savage and uncivilized the Scots were compared to the sophisticated English. Indeed, the English press at the time often portrayed Scots in a negative way, to ridicule them or to make people fear them, and accusing your enemies of cannibalism was very old propaganda. The Romans accused Jews and Christians of being cannibals, and the Protestants believed that the Catholics were cannibal witches who had to be destroyed. This political cannibal propaganda was used during the English Civil War a few decades earlier as well, when those loyal to King Charles I, the Cavaliers, and those wanting a republic, the Roundheads, fought each other for control of England. Roundhead said that King Charles' loyalist Sir Thomas Lunsford claimed his favorite food was the flesh of children. He was even painted in the act of cutting a child into steaks and broiling them. In some versions of the Sawney Bean tale, his wife was called Black Agnes, which refers to a painful moment in English history, when a real Scottish woman, Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunbar and March, called Black Agnes on account of her dark complexion, bested an Englishman. On January 13, 1338, during the Second War of Scottish Independence, the English led by William Montagu, Earl of Salisbury, laid siege on Dunbar Castle. Patrick, Earl of Dunbar and March, was away, but the Countess and her servants and guards were determined to defend the castle. During the Middle Ages, it was normal for a wife to defend a castle, but the Countess of Dunbar was remembered for a long time. The Earl of Salisbury catapulted huge rocks and lead shot against the ramparts. It barely made a dent. The Countess had one of her ladies-in-waiting dust off the ramparts with her handkerchief to taunt the besiegers. The English then deployed a siege structure called a sow to bypass the castle's defenses. Agnes ordered for boulders to be thrown down from the battlements, crushing Salisbury's sow to pieces. The Earl tried to bribe the guard at the main entrance to leave the gate unlocked so that the English could enter. The soldier took Salisbury's money, then reported the ploy to Agnes, who prepared to trap Salisbury once he entered the gate. But when he arrived, his men pushed past him to get into the castle, and when Agnes's men dropped the portcullis, Salisbury was still on the other side. Then the English took her brother John prisoner and threatened to hang him unless the Countess surrendered the castle. She huffed that her brother's death would benefit her, since she was his heir. Months into the siege, supplies were running low, but Scottish commander Sir Alexander Ramsay of Dalhousie came to the rescue and brought in 40 men by sea. When these Scotsmen charged out of the castle and pushed Salisbury's advance all the way back to their camp, the Earl admitted defeat and lifted the siege. The story of Agnes Randolph's defense of Dunbar Castle was spread far and wide. Recasting Black Agnes as a cannibal and a witch was certainly intended to defame a Scottish heroine. However, there's always an however. The anti-Scottish propaganda angle has a problem. While it's certainly possible that the Legend of Sawney Bean was repackaged at a later date as anti-Scottish propaganda, and successfully so, there's evidence that some people believe that the Scots ate children during the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion. The story printed in 1700 didn't mention Black Agnes, cast King James, a Scot, as the witch hunter hero, and along with the Bean story, many other stories of English crimes were published at this time. Granted, none of these included cannibalism. So, what could be another reason the story with all its historical inaccuracies was printed at that time? Well, horror sells. The Sawney Bean legend, in its earliest form, while its origins were possibly even older, may have originated from anti-pagan propaganda. The Church in Scotland and England detested pagan practices in all its forms, with the threat of cannibal witches being added sometime after the mid-1500s. Witches and/or cannibals were heretics and both deserved death by burning. The cannibals in the Legend of Sawney Bean suffered the same burning fate as witches generally did in Scotland. If the story was created just after 1500, by the year 1700 Sawney Bean had become a legendary figure like Robin Hood, William Tell, or Herne the Hunter, and printers figured the legend would sell. The first print was made in England, while the story wouldn't be published in Scotland until 100 years later. The printers who published chapbooks in 1700 did so to sell them and make a profit, and horror stories that fulfill the psychological need for a good scary story sell. At this time, the public was no stranger to morbid matters. Crowds attended and celebrated the public hangings. The upper classes toured prisons and madhouses as some kind of dark form of entertainment, and those who couldn't attend read the written accounts. So, the Legend of Sawney Bean was adapted to make it fit to print for its early 18th century audience, hence the discrepancies. The audience knew about witch hunts and burnings. They still experienced the lasting influence of King James I of England's Witch Act, which had been updated in 1649 to include consulters of devils and familiar spirits who'd receive a death sentence. In 1735, among growing doubt that true witchcraft existed, a new Witchcraft Act repealed that law. It was now a crime for someone to claim to have supernatural powers. It was fraud. The death penalty was replaced with fines and imprisonment. This act was repealed in the UK in 1951. The audience knew about mysterious cave dwellers. They'd heard the stories of the so-called Covenanters hunted by King Charles I and his men for resisting the appointment of bishops in Scotland who hid in caves living off the fish they caught and roasted. The audience knew about accounts of cannibalism, which may have occurred quite recently in fact. Only a decade earlier, during the 1690s, 8 consecutive harvests failed and caused a severe famine, which ended up reducing the Scottish population by about a third. Those desperately hungry could have eaten humans to keep themselves from dying. The audience also knew and was very anxious about the desecration of dead bodies. Many news stories spoke about the activities of the so-called resurrectionists or body snatchers. A resurrectionist removed bodies from their graves in the middle of the night and sold them secretly to the colleges of surgeons for dissection. This had been a common practice ever since the colleges were founded in the 1500s, but by the 1700s, the situation had gotten so out of control that the Scots stood guard over their dead with shotguns, and families put cages over grave sites, not to protect the people from the dead rising, but to protect the bodies from being stolen. In the early 1800s, the government decided to pass laws forbidding body snatching, but during the debates, the infamous team of Burke and Hare bypassed the laborious process of digging up bodies by going on a murder spree instead to sell the bodies to the Edinburgh College for a neat profit. In an eerie similarity to one aspect of the Bean tale, in which body parts were hanging from the ceiling in the cave, was a testimony given in a government hearing on the matter by Dr. G.S. Pattison, lecturer in anatomy at Glasgow University. In Glasgow at present, bodies are so scarce that they are salted in the summer and hung up and dried like Yarmouth herrings. This would have been a centuries-old practice, which was mixed into the tale. The audience certainly knew the many folk tales about travelers who never arrived at their destinations. They knew of the existence of murder inns which were found all over Europe. They knew the stories of innkeepers who were suspected of murder and that some indeed quit their jobs to avoid these accusations. And they knew the stories of bodies disappearing without a trace. It must have been a bestseller, and the simplest explanation for why the Legend of Sawney Bean endured. Horror sells, just like today. As the centuries passed, the terrifying story of Sawney Bean, the Scottish cannibal, remained popular in fiction. While folk tales no longer evolve once they appear in print, they do inspire retellings. Some versions moved locations and changed names. John MacLeod, who was hunted by the Mayor of Exeter, and another tale about John Gregg both took place in Devonshire, but the story remained virtually the same for hundreds of years. There were reprints as morality tales in the so-called The Newgate Calendar, and the Scots themselves appropriated the story to give a more tongue-in-cheek twist. The legend inspired the Victorian-era romance novel Sawney Bean, the Man-Eater of Midlothian by Thomas Prescott Prest, of Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, and Varney the Vampire fame. In 1896, about 50 years after Prest's version, the Bean Clan appeared in Samuel Rutherford Crockett's The Grey Man, set in the year 1580. Crockett was a Galwegian and well versed in the traditions and folklore of his region, and was able to add local details to flesh out, pardon the pun, the story. In 1969, Sawney Bean captured the attention of the audience at the Edinburgh Festival when a play of that name by Robert Nye and Bill Watson was so successful it ended up on the London stage. Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes from 1977, later remade by Alexandre Aja in 2006, used the Sawney Bean plot set in the modern era. The Edinburgh Dungeon has a Sawney Bean attraction, which, despite the subject not being as well known as Burke and Hare or William Wallace, usually ranks as being among the top 3 most popular attractions among visitors. All in all, the history of the Legend of Sawney Bean is as interesting as the story itself. Which historical horror would you like me to cover for next year's Halloween? Let me know in the comments. If you crave more historical horror now, do check out Defragged History's The Batavia series, about a VOC ship that wrecked on the Australian coast in 1629, where the survivors descended into the most mad and murderous state, or as author Peter Fitzsimons called it, Dexter meets Gilligan's Island, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. As always, like, subscribe, and share among your history horror friends. Until next time.